Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Murray Sperber, the author of Beer and Circus, How Big-Time College Sports is Crippling Undergraduate Education. What a title. Maybe you can explain how your book has got to be one of the most unusual titles that we've done.
Well, the title really is play on an expression in Latin poetry. A poet named Juvenal wrote about various emperors who, because their policies failed, but they wanted to distract the populace, gave them cheap daily bread and the Circus Maximus. The film Gladiator last spring, of course, is set in the kind of Roman circus. About 10 years ago, on a Saturday morning in Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is, of course, I was driving with my wife, and we happened to drive by the football stadium, and it was the morning of a Saturday game, and of course the parking lots were filled with tailgaters and such. But across the road there are student apartment complexes, and there were beer kegs on lawns and hundreds of students around, and many of them drunk already, although it was pretty early on a Saturday morning. And my wife, who went to a very different school as an undergraduate, said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "It's Beer and Circus." And I think when an author thinks of a good title, it's important to sort of go with it. But it also summed up lots of ideas that I'd been thinking about in higher education and where it was going. And so I started working on that book, and after 7 years, it's published.
Well, and this isn't just a one-time interest. This has been sort of an area that you've been doing research in for some time now.
Right. So. This is my fourth book about college sports, although this book is also about higher education. 10 years ago, I published a book about the finances of college sports called College Sports, Inc. And then I did two history books about college sports, one about Notre Dame, and the other about, also in part about Notre Dame, but the beginning of the modern NCAA and media coverage and stories about college sports. And those books are Shake Down the Thunder and Onward to Victory, but this book, again, I return to the contemporary scene and talk about sort of higher education, but what's happening at large public research universities, particularly student life. It's interesting, academics very rarely write about or even think about undergraduate student life. Most of them weren't that enamored of student life as students. They wanted to become professors, and so there's not much literature on the subject. I was surprised, and then I understood why. It happens that I was an ordinary undergraduate at Purdue University and come out of student life in many ways, particularly the collegiate kind of subculture on many campuses, and have identified with those students over the years in my teaching at Indiana, and did quite a bit of research for this book, and that's how Beer and Circus came about.
Well, and we should point out that one of the most famous collegiate coaches is at Indiana, Bobby Knight.
Was,
excuse me.
I know, it's hard. It happened, I arrived the same time he did, 29 years ago, so I have trouble using the past tense, but I'm very pleased to use the past tense.
And so that was a factor, you know, in the situation. And then also we're here in Ann Arbor with the University of Michigan, and it's had its share of big-time athletics in the college context.
That's for sure.
With, you know, back to the days of Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler and Bob Ufer, the announcer, and, you know, when everything was portrayed as Pearl Harbor and so forth. But I think it's important to point out that context, and often in talking with people as I was thinking about this book, people tend to identify the university or the higher institutions of higher learning with specific coaches or specific sports. So there's kind of a personality issue there.
Oh, no. I mean, one of the real problems for my university this past year is, and the last decade really, people were starting to call us Bob Knight U, and the controversies surrounding him so far overshadowed the academic purpose of the university. And Michigan's interesting in that it's kind of schizophrenic in a way. I mean, it's called a public Ivy. It is one of the best public universities in the country, as well as a major research university. And on the other hand, it has a whole separate commercial sports enterprise with this sports management curriculum and kinesiology that the credits, many of the credits that the athletes are sheltered in this, of course. And LS&A, the main part of the university, won't accept credits from the part that shelters the athletes. So I've long been amazed at Michigan and how it has this complicated balancing act between these essentially professional athletes and the academic side of the university. And but if you talk to Michigan alums, the old maize and blue, and they tell you it's all wonderful. It's all the world of Bob Ufer, and it's all glorious. And then, of course, a recruit or a player with recruits in the car overturns a 29,000 vehicle at 5 in the morning, and it's on the front pages of the paper. But that's what Michigan deserves, and every other university in that situation. Can't dance with the devil and always win.
Well, here in Ann Arbor, one of the things that the people who live in the town were upset about is when they decorated the stadium with this really garish yellow lettering, and it was just something like you'd find in Las Vegas, and it got to be such a hubbub about it that they actually took it down and calmed down the whole design. But it was pretty wild.
Of course, one of the remarkable things about Michigan with its it's 110 seats, correct, in the stadium, and Chrysler Arena is huge for the basketball. The athletic director said earlier this year the athletic department lost money, lost $3 million, and this is big blue. So, I mean, one of the myths about college sports is, and the public absolutely believes this, is that you're generating millions for their universities, but in fact, Michigan is very typical of many schools. At that level, and all schools at lower levels, you look at Eastern Michigan and Western Michigan and Bowling Green in Ohio and the MAC conference, they're losing a fortune on college sports. And that's one of the things I address in the book and wrote about in College Sports Inc. But it's one of the most pernicious myths in America, and I think hurts universities in that I know I give a certain number of talks to public groups like Kiwanis and Rotary and such, and very often they say, why should I, want my tax dollars to go to the universities? You're making a fortune in your sports business. And of course, that's not remotely true.
Well, and there's all these different sources of income that they have, from licenses with Nike and contracts, and then licenses for the sale of their material.
Right, but much of that money goes directly to the coaches. I mean, they're paying the coaches over $1 million a year, and part of it is the Nike shoe contracts, for instance. Almost all of that goes to the coaches. It doesn't go to the university, but of course it allows Nike, a company with terrific image problems with their Asian sweatshops and such, to associate with an institution in our society that the public thinks as quite clean and quite positive. So universities are really selling their good names to please these coaches, who they frequently fire anyway, and it's a system that truly, rationally, makes no sense whatsoever. Only when you get into the dark recesses of the fans' minds do you begin to understand the irrationality of all of this.
The dark recesses.
Well, having lived through the Bob Knight, I was the faculty member who spoke up about Bob Knight and really did see the dark recesses. I was threatened. I'm not teaching this fall because the fans downloaded my schedule of classes on their websites, on these fan websites, and said, let's invade Sperber's classes and tell him what we think of what he's saying about Coach Knight. So I had to take a leave of absence. So I think I have seen the dark recesses, and it's pretty murky there. We're not talking rational thought. We're talking, some very disturbed individuals, but even, the people who are rational, who are in control of college sports, presidents, administrators, and such, gets pretty murky in their minds when they try to justify this whole thing.
Well, one thing I think, as long as we're going on this track, is the size of this industry, which is pretty amazing. And in the book, you talk about the size of the contract that NCAA negotiates.
Right.
Maybe you can give some of these particular...
Right. Well, the most outstanding NCAA contract, and the one that attracts the most attention and the most money, is their contract with CBS TV to televise the men's basketball tournament, what's known as March Madness, through this decade into the next decade, and that's $6 billion, not $6 million, $6 billion. Now, what school presidents and administrators won't admit is this is not a contribution to higher education. This is payment for a product. And the product that schools have to deliver is college sports, basketball in this case, football for the football contracts, which are very, very lucrative, played at the highest possible level. And to turn out that product, coaches put players in very intensive training programs, 30, 40, 50 hours a week. And it's, in my research, I came across very few dumb jocks, and more often, even at Michigan, physically and mentally exhausted athletes who essentially had to get their education around the margins of their lives. I came to see them as vocational students, people who work at very hard jobs during the day and have to get an education around that. And the NCAA doesn't want to admit it. You turn on the basketball games, the football games, it's all this stuff about student athletes, these fine young men and women and such. And indeed, many of them are quite fine, but they're not getting, the student part is in tiny, tiny agate type, and the athlete part is huge, huge. And so big-time college sports and the people who run it is a huge industry, and people who run it don't want to admit that. And, CBS TV is not paying a dime to televise Hope versus Albion, which are Division III schools with actual students playing basketball for them. That won't get the ratings and such. And the other part of the hypocrisy is the whole gambling, certainly on March Madness. Billions are bet. The ratings, CBS is giving the $6 billion in part because of the ratings, and people are tuning in to see how their bets are doing more than their team, and their team's probably eliminated or not even in the tournament. So there's huge hypocrisy, and it's an industry that gets bigger and bigger and is very corrosive to higher education, it seems to me.
Well, one of the things you make a point in your book is that the concern for the specific person who is the student athlete is not very, just like you said, as a student, it's not tremendous concern. It's there's some real dangers for injury in football,
Right.
Can be even a killer, or
Right.
certainly, injuring for the rest of their life.
Right.
And there's no real provision for what happens if that person's injured in the game.
Well, they do have insurance. There was a period before the 1990s where they didn't have much insurance and players were very disposable. They do have insurance policies now, but I think short of catastrophic injuries, which don't happen that frequently, fortunately, you have a whole world of sort of injuries for life. Your knee will never come back. At the age of 50, you're going to have trouble walking. Indeed, you might have had many concussions, various other things. And in this sense, it's very hard to play college football and not end up with some serious injuries. Now, of course, players participate in this. I mean, there's so much money in professional football. If you're good enough to play football or basketball for Michigan, you think you're good enough to play in the NBA or the NFL and such, and now only a tiny percentage are and actually make it, but the rest do participate fully in the stream, and their parents participate in it, and certainly the coaches encourage it and such. So it's really a commentary on how important sports have become in our society, and you see it at the high school level, you see it at the junior high and even earlier levels. So I guess one of the sad things is many people in our society believe that an athletic scholarship is this wonderful thing that their children should seek and hold. And I know I do a lot of sort of radio talk shows and phone-in shows, and people ask me, they say, my daughter just won a scholarship, or my son, you know, what do you think about this? And they expect me to say, oh, it's wonderful, it's great. But I don't, because I've seen the reality and I've done a lot of research on it. And I think people don't realize that an athletic scholarship is a one-year contract which is renewed every July. There is a kind of myth that it's a guarantee for 4 years. It was. Scholarships came into the NCAA in the 1950s, and up till the early 70s were guaranteed 4-year deals. But the coaches couldn't stand that because they'd give scholarship to players who didn't work out, and they'd have to carry them for a couple of years. So they got the NCAA to change it to a one-year renewable contract, basically. It's renewed every July at the behest of the coach, and very frequently for athletic performance. And so if your son or daughter manages to win an athletic scholarship, essentially what he or she has won is a full-time, very demanding job for the next 4 years or so, and a job that won't allow for classes in the afternoon. So if he or she wants to be a pre-med or an architecture student or anything that has studios or labs in the afternoons, forget it. And it's also a job that will probably get your son or daughter channeled into Mickey Mouse curriculum and such, because the athletic department's not concerned with their education, it's concerned with keeping them eligible. Now, there are some athletes who are able to get good educations, and my hat is off to them because they're essentially working 2 full-time jobs. But the great majority can't do it, and it's a system that doesn't allow them to do it, and it's very early on they don't try to do it, unfortunately. And so it's another one of the great myths that's sort of perpetrated by universities on the population, and it sort of astounds me to see parents buy into it and think this is all wonderful.
It has a corrosive effect down even into the high school. People have this mythology, or hold to this mythology, that if their son or daughter, like you were saying, could just get that athletic scholarship, and so
Right.
they're pumping, you know, through the high school years, giving their all for athletics.
Right.
Then,
Right.
thinking that, you know, and the odds are really small. They're
Right,
minuscule.
I think that's right. I think it particularly hurts minority youngsters. I know Harry Edwards, the African-American sociologist at Berkeley, has done a lot of work on this, and he goes around and he talks to African-American groups, and he says, look, your son or daughter has a better chance to be a brain surgeon than play in the NBA or the WNBA and the NFL. But so many kids just put everything into that athletic dream and such, and don't end it, because 1% of 1% actually makes the NBA or the NFL. There's a lot of wasted lives out there, or parts of lives. Now, the other side of it, though, which is interesting to me, I've had athletes in classes after their eligibility is over, or after their athletic career is over through injury, and they're often excellent students, because one thing sports does, it teaches you discipline, teaches you time use, various other things, and they're finally able to concentrate on going to school full time, and they can bring that discipline to the classroom, and often they do excellently after their athletic career is over, which is kind of sad that it's only then. Now, some schools, the Big Ten schools, are very good about guaranteeing an athlete's scholarship after the eligibility is over, but that's unusual. Most schools just won't do it and sort of chew them up, spit them out and such, and that's in part the reason for the low graduation rate that athletes have.
I'm glad you mentioned the graduation rate, because there was just a survey that came out, and
Right. So,
U of M did not do all that well.
No.
In fact, I think not one black athlete has graduated in, the last 10 years or something,
like that.
which is a horrible
Right.
statistic.
Now, one of the things they like to do is they like to compare it to regular graduation rates of regular students. U of M doesn't do it because their regular graduation rate is quite high. But at my school, for instance, it's about 59% for the athletes, 59% for the regular students, except that's like comparing apples to alligators. I mean, the main reason regular students don't graduate is not academic. It's financial. They can't afford the increasing tuition, the room and board rates and all of this, and they leave Indiana University of Bloomington and they go back to the town they're from, and they go to another school or whatever. Whereas I've never met an athlete who couldn't pay his or her tuition bill or room and board bill. It's paid for them. So they don't have the financial problem. But it's basically the academics. They've been turned off from academics. They're very far from graduating. They've been in Mickey Mouse curriculum very often. And so that's why their rates are low. Plus, the NCAA doesn't count transfers. If you transfer to another school, as some athletes do, you're not counted as a negative graduation statistics, whereas schools count transfers. And so it's all done to try to get the maximum athletic graduation rate, and it still keeps dropping and dropping. And I think what happened in Michigan is very typical of many, many schools.
So it ends up that the student comes to the institution, and the purpose is to have them complete the course of study, and instead what they complete the games part of it.
Right. And over again, athletes who, when their eligibility is over, unfortunately, because they haven't seen much purpose in going to class along the way, especially in Mickey Mouse courses, they don't, even if the school, as Michigan will, pay their tuition for the rest, for as long as they're making academic progress. They just don't see the point of it, and they leave. But to be fair, that tends to happen in the high-profile sports like football and basketball. I have a kind of theory that the further you are from the money, the higher your graduation rates. So women's field hockey is in the 80 percentile because there's no pro women's field hockey to go to. And these women do work hard, but usually the coaches are more academically oriented and are very supportive of the women field hockey players. So that's up there, and down at the other extreme is men's basketball, because there's not only the NBA, but the CBA and all kinds of leagues overseas. And I guess the real proof to me is what's happened in women's basketball in the last 10 years. From pretty good graduation rates in the 60 percentile, it's now down to the 40 percentile, mainly because of the WNBA, and there's now opportunities for women to play pro basketball as well as overseas pro basketball. So as they get closer to the money, they get further from an education, and the coaches also are making more money. I think that's part of, as they get closer to the big bucks, they put more pressure on the athletes to devote everything to the sport. So it's a very vicious system, and it seems to me that universities that once stood for ethics and ethical conduct and reason are totally involved in this very unethical and very irrational enterprise.
One of the things that fascinates me about your book is that there are other topics that we've done interviews with, and where people had trouble doing the interviews or having people want to go on the record or identified. Really? And that was one thing that you ran into here. The other topics, interestingly enough, were abortion, the hot button things in public discourse. But You ran into, I mean, you're talking
Right.
about what you ran into with the Bobby Knight thing, but there
Right.
were other people that were very concerned about what would happen if they became identified.
Right. Certainly administrators worry a great deal about boosters, the sort of fans who are not alums of the university, sometimes they are, and the kind of pressure they'll put on them if they make a remark off the record, just about every college president I've spoken to has said, if they invented college sports today, there's no way I'd let my school get involved in this. And some are very negative about college sports. Amazingly, I mean, these are presidents of schools with huge college sports programs. But you ask them to go on the record, and almost never. Jim Duderstadt at Michigan was somewhat unusual in that when he was president, he had questions about college sports, but he caught a lot of flack for that. But lower administrators are even more reticent to go on the record. And I think you're right. I think there's so much irrationality in this whole thing that they just don't want to be quoted. And it was sort of amazing to me how reticent people wanted to talk about it. They just didn't want their names ascribed to it.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you.